This is The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner from Book Public on Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. We're talking about Juan Rulfo again this week with a special guest, Alberto Reyes Morgan. He was a student of Peter Orner's, but is also a literary scholar and writer in his own right. We discussed the third in our series focusing on the stories of Juan Rulfo, the story Luvina. In literature, we often encounter the characters who live their days steeped in nostalgia, the Willy Loman types who hearken back to the glory days when everything was cast in the golden light of hope and potential. In Luvina, by Juan Rulfo, however, we find a character who's convinced that the past is cast only in darkness because it was spent in Luvina, a town that he claims was inhospitable, unlivable, even phantasmagorical in its dark silences and lack of vivacity or color. The man had been a teacher in Luvina, had arrived there with his wife and children in the dark of an endless night that portended the awful years he would spend there. When our story opens, the old teacher is sitting in a bar, one town over from Luvina. He drinks beer and tells his tale of woe as a cautionary tale to the younger man who will be the new teacher in the town. With that man, we listen to the teacher's story, watch as he downs his beers, shushes the children playing around him. If those were the bad old days, how can sitting in this bar getting drunker by the minute, impatient with the sound of children, be any better? Juan Rulfo has said that the story Luvina was a sort of gateway to his acclaimed novel Pedro Páramo, calling his other stories mere exercises. That would be difficult for many of us who admire all of Rulfo's stories to accept. What is sure is that Rulfo achieves incredible moments in the short stories where, as Susan Sontag wrote, the elaboration of a single event or the introspection of a single character allows him to illuminate the meaning, often the utter despair, of a man's life. Rulfo had many gifts and talents as a writer. He was able to give us the most memorable characters in the most essential and spare terms. Sontag writes, they were like the landscape, frequently clouded over and hazy, or blurred and imprecise and taciturn figures. What does come forth, she says, clear and ubiquitous, is death, overpowering life. We see again and again in these stories a landscape that is bleak and harsh. Life seems paralyzed, and even the introspection of the characters comes through in fits and starts that leave us only clues about characters whose lives remain richly mysterious to us. These are ostensibly simple people whose interior lives are as complicated as any we will ever encounter in literature. That may well be what's before us in this story, an old teacher bemoaning the years he lost in a place that only by his own accounting here wasn't worth living in. But what do we make of the fact that he remained there for 15 years, and that it's only now, as he sits reaching across the table to take the beer of his listener, that he allows the bleak elements of this present situation to color the time he spent in Luvina? Alberto Reyes Morgan, Peter Orner, and I discuss now Luvina by Juan Rulfo.
I've got I'm reading Elena Poniatowska's, she's got this book, Ida y Vuelta, There and Back. She has an interview with Rulfo, and there's a paragraph. I could read it to you. The interview is titled The Writer in Flames, and she starts off with this. Mr. Rulfo, and literature? What do you want me to say? I'm not an intellectual. I was raised in San Gabriel, and people there told me a lot of stories of terrors, of wars, and of crimes. I always lived with men of the country that when the sun sets and they light up a hand-rolled cigarette, they suddenly say to the person that's with them, remember when? And even if the other person doesn't reply, they begin to remember about that time that the Chivo Encantado got caught. They got him while he was sleeping, right? Or when do you think? And they cut off his head from just beneath his beard. So I just think that's kind of a relevant, specifically, the idea that it doesn't matter if the other person replies, for this story in particular.
I love that. Did you translate that, Pedro? Or
I've been reading it, and I know we're mainly sticking to the text, but I just thought it was, interesting that he says something so specific. And also Poniatowska, she's a great interviewer, writer too. But so she gets this out of him, he just says this because he's kind of usually reserved in a lot of his interviews. He specifically states that in that specific interview and in several other interviews that his intent, he had a very clear intent with the story, it seems to me, or he said so himself, to write a story outside of time and space. That idea really interested him. And although he has also mentioned that the idea of Pedro Páramo preceded the Plane in Flames in a way, and it was through writing Luvina that he sort of, it seems, found a way to achieve that. And I think, this may be a interesting or a good point to go into the text, because he sort of does it, I think, essentially in that second paragraph. There's it really stands out to me, and it always has when I read this story, because that second paragraph of Luvina functions sort of as a bridge between the omniscient narrator and the man, the ex-teacher of Luvina, who is talking to the soon-to-be teacher of Luvina. In that second paragraph, it's as if Rulfo is writing, I've always felt like, the act of remembrance, because we're not with the man yet, but it's moving towards that. It's sort of, the story opens up sort of incredibly zoomed out and talks to us about the highest and the rockiest points of the South, right? It starts off of all the high ranges in the South, the one in Luvina is the highest and rockiest. So it opens up really big, and it sort of starts to zoom in and focus more and more and more until suddenly we're sitting, by the third paragraph, we're sitting with the man at the bar, having a beer, talking to the soon-to-be new teacher of Luvina. So I think I've gone off on a tangent now. Sorry.
No, that works.
There's a lot here.
To bring it, I mean, I think going into the first paragraph is key to positioning this story, and also just like how it starts in motion completely, right in its like landscape, without giving us any introduction about where we are or anything like that. I love the way this story opens.
Right.
In terms of Pedro Páramo, and again, people listening to this might not know the book or even know any of these stories. I think what this story does, and what Pedro Páramo does, like you say, like this out of time and space, and yet the way this story gets there is with a great deal of specificity, right? So you actually are somewhere very particular. Of all the high ranges in the South, the one in Luvina is the highest and the rockiest. So it's a very specific place. So it's a fascinating way to start a story that you are then literally, and you're telling us he was literally trying to have it not be grounded in that way. But it's, so it's like almost like it starts in Plane in Flames and like then moves off of it. That's how it feels to me, like an incredibly specific place that is also very murky.
Right. And it's exactly that, right? Through the specificity of it, it sort of becomes universal. Because that first sentence, I was just thinking about this as I was rereading it these few days. How important it is that he doesn't write. It's, what he omits is just as important, right? He doesn't say of all the high ranges in the South of Mexico. I mean, that is such a great omission. I feel like somebody else, I probably would have written that, but he just says of all the high ranges in the South. He gives you enough specifics to make it, make it a universal, sort of a bigger story through making it a small story, if that makes any sense. Because I kept wondering also, why does he care about writing out of time and space? Does he just want to do that out of interest for that? But I think because if he made it outside of time and space, it makes it a bigger experience in a way. Because as you said, Peter, yeah, the story it is out of time and space, and yet it's called Luvina. We know exactly where we are. or what the man is talking about, at least.
So, in thinking about this motivation to make it out of time and space, and then have this level of specificity, and then also the omission of the mention of Mexico, right? Why do you suppose the very next thing is something so specific with the shift in point of view that starts with "You'll see that wind blowing over Luvina," and what comes next? Like what do you think is? I mean, not to like try to read his mind and figure out his thought process, but if we have this information about what his motives were, what he wanted the story to be, why do you think there's this teacher now in this cantina?
In some ways, we're a little bit pie in the sky for Rulfo, right? Already, right? I mean, the fact is, you have a guy in a cantina store with a bar. He's drinking beers. Someone apparently has come to this place, and he has asked, and this man, the teller of the story, has said, "Hey, who are you? Where are you going?" And this person apparently told him, although we never get this traveler apparently told him, "Yeah, I'm going to Luvina." And he's like, "Oh, Luvina, right. I know Luvina." And I mean, how many times have you been in a situation where somebody pulls rank like this? Like, I know the place you're going to. Let me tell you about it. That's the sort of premise. It's a classic, way of entering a story where you two strangers meet. One stranger tells the other stranger how it is. That's the for me, that's like the, I don't know what you call it, the frame of the story. Except that here we never get the person, we never get the listener. So in a sense, we become the listener in the story. We're the traveler. We're the people going to Luvina. We are now that person, and we are going to Luvina. But before we go there, we're going to hear all about it.
We're going to hear all about the mistake we're making with our life, going to the same place.
Right, right. And who wants to hear that ever, right?
No, I mean, I was just thinking as you're reading this, the new teacher, the traveler, he's I think he's, I'm just putting myself in those shoes, pretty annoyed, right? He's basically just telling this guy, you're making this huge mistake. He's not just telling him about the place, he's telling him, why are you doing this? This place is terrible.
I mean, not only is it terrible, I mean, it goes at the bottom of the first page, a wind that doesn't even let bittersweet grow. Those sad little plants can barely live, holding on for all their worth to the side of the cliffs and these hills as if they were smeared onto the earth. Only at times when there's a little shade hidden among the rocks can the how do you say? Chicolote? Chicolote bloom with its white poppies. But the chicolote soon withers. Then one hears it scratching the air with its thorny branches, making a noise like a knife on a whetstone. So while on the one hand, it has a sort of a premise that we can understand, the people that have pulled rank on me to tell me about where I'm going are not this explicit, and don't sort of suddenly, I mean, the story becomes weird right away.
Right, and then that paragraph begins with those suspension ellipses. Is that what that is? So it's as if, because you keep seeing those in the rest of the story. Right. I get the feeling, when there's a silence and the guy's taking a sip of his beer, a drink. So yeah, it's media res, and he's already answering, or not answering the guy's question, probably just talking to the guy who didn't ask anything.
Right. He probably hasn't asked a single question. That's what it seems like.
Although there's the rest of the story.
There's one indication. You asked me something or other. I forget where it is, but it'll come up, I'm sure. But so
like 20 minutes ago, maybe.
Right. Yvette?
Well, I'm really stuck with this story on the reliability or unreliability of the narrator, and the fact that he really probably thinks he will not dissuade this younger teacher from going to Luvina. The repeated, you'll see, You'll see. And he paints this picture that is so bleak and so terrible, and then continues with, well, but you'll see, because that's what happened to him, right? And so, but also it is this idea that you guys were talking about around almost one-upping himself with every bleak description. The next one is somehow worse than the one before, and it is this idea of owning the space, of owning that place, and being the expert on that place. And it sounds terrible. It sounds like a
Right.
terrible place. But, when people talk about certain places, and they paint them in such grim, bleak, horrible ways, they usually don't leave that space, right? Or it's much worse than, the description is much worse than the actual place. So I'm always immediately into the notion of the reliability and the unreliability, and I always find I'm in both camps. I do believe it's a bleak, desolate place. I do believe that these terrible things are the result of what the government hasn't done and this terrible history. But at the same time, I feel like here's this guy sitting in the bar drinking more and more, and there's just more to it, which makes the story so rich for me when I can go into the motivation of the character.
I wonder if reading the story this morning, I had a reaction. I thought, this guy's an entertainer. He's entertaining himself. He's entertaining me with how bad this place is. I want to go there. And that's what I decided today. Like, I'm not dissuaded by this. I am.
Sounds fascinating, right?
Right. I mean, how could a place be so bad as this? It's almost like he is ginning up his own storytelling, and as he's drinking, obviously. So I mean, we talk about reliability all day, and I'm always wondering, I'd be hard pressed to find, like, who is that reliable narrator out there in the world? Does that person exist?
But I think you bring yourself to every place you enter. Like, I really think a lot about Rulfo. I mean, I'm picturing Rulfo sitting there at the bar. I really think in terms of, yeah, it really is that terrible. And it really is that enticing. People always describe the phantasmagorical elements of this story. And I always think, no, like, this is all too real. And it is a real place, of course, right? It is there really is a San Juan Luvina, right? So, and it looks beautiful. They have a Facebook page. It looks quite idyllic. It looks beautiful. Beautiful
I'm sure
people.
They're thrilled about this story.
I know. I wonder about that. But I mean, it looks like a beautiful place, and it looks like many other places I've seen in Mexico, right? So it's like, it is that the specificity of it, the universality of it, it's all there. And I didn't mean, like, let's get into the unreliable narrator, like this is the only place to go with the story. On the contrary, it almost doesn't matter. It's just all here on the page. You bring yourself to the spaces that you enter. That's the perspective now that he's projecting, right? And I don't know. I mean, part of me is feeling a little bit like, is this his perspective because he's drinking and getting drunker, or does he drink because this was his reality, right? As a teacher in this town.
There's also I think a point to be made that he might just be talking, or at least talking so much, he has all these pauses and then he'll sort of keep talking again. To keep drinking, he drinks the guy's beer, right? He says, I'm trying to look for it, but drink your beer. I see you haven't even tried it. Drink, or perhaps you don't like it as it is at room temperature. And then at some point later, he just straight up just asks him for the beer.
You know, and with Rulfo, there's not a single word wasted, as you know. And very early on, the guy is trying to tell the children to be quiet. The children's screams got closer, and he says, "Get away from here! Stop interrupting!" And it's such a, it's so unusual if you consider that he has spent years of his life in this terrible Luvina, that it was so quiet and so bleak and so terrible. And now in this other space, he's quieting the children and doesn't welcome those sounds, right? Like maybe that's a little too on the nose, and it maybe doesn't mean anything. But I'm always struck by that, like these interjections of details that seem out of place, or like, do we really need to know this? And those are the moments where I dig in a little bit more.
Well, I do think it's relevant that's what I was asking earlier, because Luvina is described as a, terrible place, but the store isn't all that great either. It's being eaten up by termites.
Mm-hmm.
The place is rotting away. The place that he's sitting in. So speaking of those details, sort of moving a little bit towards the end of the story, where the image that Rulfo leaves us with is the termites, now without wings, circled like naked little worms. So even these termites are also stuck in that place. They don't have wings anymore. They've been burned. Mm-hmm. Like the guy that's just sort of been sitting there drinking. He probably goes, you'd assume he drinks there every day. We don't really know where he is as far as the town or anything, right? He sort of only exists in, the only place he really exists with in the story is him remembering this place, Luvina, as he talks to the teacher, mm-hmm. to the new teacher. So I do like those details in the sort of present of the story, and they are very relevant, I think. Yeah, no word is wasted.
The sensory imagery in the story, it's on all levels, all the senses. What you're not tasting or seeing or smelling, right? It is everywhere in this story. And there's a moment, it's on my page 69, where he says, no matter how you look at it, Luvina is a very sad place. Now that you're going there, you'll see what I mean. I would say it's the place where sadness nests, where smiles are unknown, as if everyone's faces had gone stiff. And if you want, you can see that sadness at every turn. And later he describes finally there is a smile, but it's not a good moment, right? When they laugh, it was the only time I saw the people from Luvina laugh. They bared their ruined teeth. It's like there's pasojos de agua. There's so much that's on a level of sensory imagery that you do feel like this incredible immersion in the space as he's describing it to this captive audience. This guy sitting there with him at the bar.
You know how we talked about this, Yvette. Like when you read a story at different times, you have different reaction to it. And I just had this, just building, trying to, like, in terms of what you're saying about, like, where he's coming from, the storyteller. It seems to me today, that this story is, like, less about Luvina and more about what happened to him in this particular town. And I just kept thinking, like, thinking back to, like, the worst moments of my life, where they were, and how I would then describe the place that those events took place in, and how that would color everything I would say about that town. I don't deny that there's this horrible wind, that there's basically only old people, that all the young people have left, all those very real, concrete details that he is clearly exaggerating in a very beautiful way. One of my favorite lines in the whole story is, on many days the wind, this is the wind he's talking about, on many days it carries off the roofs of houses as if it were carrying off a straw hat. I love that. Just like, the hat is compared to the roofs of the houses. Mm-hmm. But let's maybe interject that the storyteller has come to this place years and years ago, which apparently is in the distance, right? I mean, I don't. Do you guys see that? Read it that way. That Luvina is not all that far from where we're sitting at this point, right?
Right.
Yeah, you get the feeling it's near physically. I mean, right?
So he looks out into the distance and at least, if not sees Luvina, at least knows it's there. This is the place he has come, that he once came when he was a young, idealistic, young teacher with his 3 kids and his wife. And it all went to shit really quickly. Really quickly. The first day, the mule driver drops them off and does not even wait for the mules to get rested or get some water before he takes off. That's rough. That's a rough entry, right?
It's like a horror story where they don't want to go into the town with you.
Totally. And Rulfo is not above using those kind of tropes, right?
Oh no.
But I'm just like thinking that I was just trying to put myself, or just kind of the idea of the worst thing that can possibly happen, and we don't know what happened with his wife and his 3 kids. But I guess my thought is they're not around. He either drank himself half to death in Luvina, or something went down there that wasn't going to allow this family to stay together. And then now he's got that weight. And so now here comes some young whippersnapper. Oh, you're going to Luvina? Well, let me tell you, that place. And he doesn't get specific about himself until later in the story, which is when it gets, really beautiful and incredibly hard, almost hard to read when he's in the church with his kids and they're all huddled together, trying to stay out of the wind. And Beto, I think we've even talked a lot about this image, about the sound of the bats, just the visceral nature of his experience, which happened to him many, many years ago. I just think you were dealing with a haunted guy who is, kind of almost wants to foist that hauntedness off on us, because we are, again, that person who's listening to him.
I do get the impression that the man and this new teacher share the root cause of where these ideas come from, right? The ideas that he says that infuses all. Just to sort of place this in a historical context, it seems like they're talking about the Cardenista push to move teachers into the rural areas of Mexico. So, it seems like he went through the same sort of program. He got these ideas. He says, in those days I was strong, I was full of ideas. And right, here comes this new teacher right after the ideas have been beaten out of him by this place, Luvina, and he lost his wife and his kids. And he sees this new teacher and he's like, oh, now you're the guy that the government has put all their ideas into. And now you're going into this town. And this paragraph comes right after he speaks about how he tried to tell the people of Luvina that the government could help them, right? Which is the scene Yvette was speaking of, when they laugh and show their broken teeth.
There is so much here about old versus young, right? The old versus new and old versus young, that fits with this notion of how you read something differently. Each time you read it, you come at it sort of with a different mindset. So I do see that. Here's this guy who was a teacher who's telling these kids to be quiet, right? And warning this guy, telling him how terrible it is. And then I keep thinking about, and this is the guy who sent Agripina, his poor wife, ahead with the youngest child to scout for a place to sleep. Yeah, I always wonder about that part.
Right. He lands there. He's like, okay, go find us someplace to sleep. Go find us some food while I stand here and wait for you. Today I was reading the story in White River Junction, where I work. It's a town that is
That's the name of the town?
Yeah, it's called White River Junction, and it's got 2 interstates. It's becoming gentrified, but it's got 2 interstates that intersect, 89 and 91 here in Vermont. And it's a town that's seen better days, for sure. And I was walking, it was starting to snow, the first day of snow today. And I was walking reading the story, and I just felt like, even though I'm like way up here in Vermont, it felt like, no one's out. Partly it's the pandemic. I don't know. I don't know where this is going, except to say that I was sitting I was cold. I got cold, so I went in the old hotel, which is this old railroad hotel that has never been refurbished. It sort of just kind of stays the same, and I love it. And I was sitting in the lobby where you're really not supposed to be because of the pandemic, but no one was around, so I was reading. But there was someone else in there, I think kind of out of the cold. The front desk clerk walked by this woman and said to her, "Hey, how are you?" And this woman said, "Very tired today. I'm very." I wrote all this down in the margin of the story. Very tired today. I'm very. And the desk clerk says, "It's the weather. I find it very hard to." Yeah. And then she walked by past that. And I felt like it was sort of a, everything's Rulfo when you're reading Rulfo, right? But
those were those ellipses right there.
Exactly. I mean, just like it's all like they understood each other. And I'm, kind of just sitting there, writing it all down while they don't know it. But this story just, it's as much to me about how people try and define their lives, and then when their lives are almost over, or they've been through all this whatever trauma, whatever you want to call it, and then someone new comes along without all that baggage, or however you want to say it, and then that person tells you, well, hey, look, this kid, this is how it's going to be. This is how it's going to be. This is what's going to happen in your ideals, right? And then when you mention the government, because that's the killer, right? That's when he starts really, really getting to him. And he's like, don't even kid yourself. There's not a chance.
I think that's the universality of it, right? I mean, sort of speaking to what you said, what you saw, Rulfo is everywhere, which I find fascinating, that he writes so specifically about a time and a place, with not just in Spanish, in specifically Mexican Spanish, not even Mexican, specifically Jalisciense Spanish, rural Jalisciense Spanish, and he achieves this universality through it. It's quite a feat.
And he does say that there's that part near the end. He says, "In those days, I was strong. I was full of ideas." You know that ideas infuse us all, and one goes with a burden on one's shoulders to make something out of one's life, but it didn't work out in Luvina. I did the experiment and it came undone. And I can't help but think about how he stayed there for all those years, and whatever his standards were, whatever his goals were that were unmet, it's Luvina's fault.
Right, which makes me very suspicious.
And sad.
Yes, that it's not Luvina's fault. It's
Luvina and the people of Luvina, right? He's pretty rough on the villagers.
Yeah. Yeah. Now he's rough on the kids that are trying to play. That scene you mentioned, Yvette, earlier, on page 68. The children's scream got close until they were inside the store. And this is the only time we see this a couple times. The narrator of the story, who's the listener, I think, that made the man stand up, go up to the door and say to them. He stands a couple of times, but no description of him. No, you think it's just his voice, but there are moments where we see this person sort of get up and go to the door into this incredible space of light, which is up on page 68. He talks about the screams of the children playing in the little space illuminated by the light coming out of the store. The kids are playing in the little square of light coming out of the store. It's just, Rulfo never forgets that the story is the story, like the story of his time in Luvina, but it's also very much the story of him telling the story in this moment. And it's tiny things, like we talked about earlier, but these little tiny things. I mean, I never forget that square of light in those kids.
and the thing is, I started to hunt for the places where he talks about children, and not to fast forward too much, but I'm going to do it. On 75, where he says the already distant shouting of children through the small sky of the doorway, one could see the stars. And I thought about the square of light, and I thought about the sort of like this repetition of that here. The small sky of the doorway, one could see the stars. And not to be too corny, right? But those are the stars over Luvina. And he's the one who's slumped there on the table, asleep, drunk, with the dead termites around him. And Luvina is over there in the starlight.
Makes it sound beautiful.
We've talked about the other translation, the one that I was reading for years before this one came out.
I was surprised you told me about this translation. I always thought you preferred the shade.
I've been won over, and I
Really?
think part of it is a line like that, which I actually don't have the shade. It's somewhere, but I don't think that line
Right
is
here?
translated like that. Do you know? Can you find that line?
Sure. Yeah, at the very end.
Yeah. Now we're totally geeking out.
Oh no, I mean I was trying not to do this because I have a lot to say about the translations, but
Well, we should hold it, but because I think there's stuff about the story we want to get to, but definitely I would love to hear
the last line.
on that. But yeah, the line about the small sky of the doorway, that's not in the old translation, is it?
Mm-mm.
No, and actually, remember, he doesn't. This is one of my points when we spoke about this. He doesn't call them termites, also, which was a thing I didn't like. But anyway, yeah. So he says, that second to last paragraph. Outside, you could hear the night advancing, the lap of the water against the fig tree trunks, the children shouting now far away, the stars peering through the small hole of the door.
That's not bad, right? and
he has his points, shade.
Yeah, I mean, he's the one who brought him to us for all these years before the new translation came out. So I'm grateful for that. And I've tried to read this so many times in Spanish, and I always just, it's very. I have my friend across the street is from Puebla, and he says that the language seems simple, but it isn't. It's not simple in Spanish, and certainly not simple in English. But the sentences are sometimes short. That doesn't make it easy to read, according to my neighbor.
No, he uses very old-fashioned, very rural, very Jalisco language. I mean, it is very specific to a time and place.
Can we look at page 72? So this is where we get a moment.
A break in the page?
Yeah, I think it's a real significant movement here, and it does implicate or suggest the idea that the listener has asked a question at some point in this conversation, maybe at the beginning, like, "Oh, you were in Luvina? How many years were you there?" Like, totally innocent question. And then he waits until fairly late in the story. "I believe you asked me how many years I was in Luvina, right? Truth is, I don't know. I lost any sense of time once the fever got me all turned around, but it must have been an eternity." What do you guys make of this break and then this movement into this other?
I'll be honest, I didn't think that was a question. That's an interesting take. I'd have to think about that. I thought he was getting more booze. I thought it was a break, like in the action of the present, It was like in a movie where it just sort of fades out and then fades back in or something.
I think it is that, but I think something happens in the telling here. I would say and it's just basically transparent. It goes back to what you said at the beginning, Beto, which is what Rulfo declared, and I'm always dubious of that, but what he actually said he was trying to do in this story. He says it right here. "I lost any sense of time.
Right.
Once the fever got me all turned around. Must have been an eternity." We move from any notion that this is sort of a realistic story, even though I will go to my grave saying it absolutely is realistic, at the same time being a fantastical, both. I don't think there needs to be one or the other. It's not magical. This isn't quantifiable. Now suddenly he has no notion of how long he was there. It must have been an eternity. I mean, it's comic in a way.
I mean, I've always found Rulfo to have a great sense of what do you call it? Black humor, you know?
Yeah.
And for me, it kind of goes back to what Yvette was saying. She mentioned unreliable narrator, because here he says, you know, must have been an eternity, right? Lit textually, but it must have been an eternity. Page later, or 2 pages later, he says it was 15 years ago. So I guess it wasn't an eternity after all.
Right. Or it's both, right? I mean, 15 years can be an eternity, right? I mean, it circles around, but absolutely, that's hilarious.
But that's the mark of somebody who, you know, who's talking to you and exposes himself as a liar, right? Or at least, to be more kind, you know, his exaggeration ebbs and flows, right? So
we would say in Spanish, tiene labia, like
yeah.
the guy knows how to speak. He really, you know, he really puts the crema on the taco, you know.
Yeah, because he does it. He does that. He lays it on so thick, and you can begin to believe it and just respect him for his point of view. And in the very next beat, he's disavowing the whole thing, right? Or he's contradicting the whole thing.
Because he's keeping the story going, right? I mean, what the object of this is to get more beer. I mean, he's singing for his supper. This is an old trick. You don't have to tell somebody a happy story to get the beer. You just got to tell them a story, right? And a story that you're going to fall into, and especially like, how about a horror story, right? Oh, you're going to Luvina? Oh, I got a story for you, right? This is, oh my God, is it bad there? But it's so bad. The women are bats. You know, I mean, it's bad. But
this is his story. You know, everybody has a story. This is his story. To go back to the part where Beth was quoting about the 15 years, he says, I was told the same thing. You're going to San Juan Luvina. It's so at the fore of his mind. It's so on the tip of his brain, right? Like, this is the guy's whole story. It's not just like it left its mark and it made such an imprint. When this is his story. This is the story he tells at bars. This is the story he'll tell in the lobby of a hotel, right? This is his story.
Right, Camilo, the bartender, the store tender, has probably heard this thousands of times.
More than that, probably. And I would just add that he's selling it cheap. There's a James Allen McPherson story, one of my favorites, called Gold Coast. And in that story, it involves an apprentice janitor talking to a janitor. And at one point, the apprentice janitor, is the narrator of the story, says, you know, Sullivan was telling me the stories of a lifetime, you know, for basically a glass of wine, you know, really, really cheap. And it strikes me at a certain point, I think everybody gets there. And I you know, absolutely, that this is his story, except that with the really painful parts omitted. Mm-hmm. Right? What happened to those 3 kids? Mm. What happened to his wife?
Probably the reason he's drinking, right?
I find so compelling something I'm embarrassed for all the times I've read this story. I've never thought of the younger teacher as the first narrator.
I had not either. Peter just blew me away with that one too.
Well, I might be totally making that up, but
I'd have some questions for you about that if we talk about this later, though.
I mean, I you know, and it's not I don't think it's a huge deal, but I feel like from the very beginning of the story, that's how I feel. I feel like it's you know, there are two storytellers in the story. The one who's the one who's not speaking when the storyteller is on stage, and that is the person who's listening to all of this. But that's just my.
No, I think it's interesting. I don't know why I had never considered that. I think because the beginning feels so. The first paragraph feels so omniscient to me. I guess is the word, omniscient narrator. But yeah, I'd have to think about that.
I mean, you know, to get all geeky and crafty, Beto. I mean, I think it can be both. I mean, I think Rulfo is like any great one. He's slippery. There isn't,
Yeah.
you know,
No, that's fine. I buy it. I buy it. Yeah.
you know, I feel like, I mean, I feel it in the end too. You know, the man who was watching the termites slumped over the table and fell asleep. We got to be in the room for that.
Well, that's kind
Whether
of,
or not you're
you said that, and I was reading that little part right now. And yeah, it really feels like that's somebody in there with him.
yeah, but you know, certainly an omniscient narrator can be in the room. That's the point of them. But it feels like to me there's somebody sitting there.
But yeah, it feels like I'm saying, like, yeah, sorry, it feels like it's the guy that's been there the whole time. And because it's the same outside, one could hear the night advancing. That's the same sentence we got a few pages back. So, you know, I guess it's an interesting thing. It would make sense if it's the same guy.
Let me ask this: what are the images? What are the things that like recur when you think about this story? And people are going to think we're crazy because like we're probably between the three of us probably have a lot of readings of this story, like more than most normal people would ever imagine, right? But I mean, Luvina is a story you don't read it once; you read it, you know, you read it 12 times. Like that's just how this goes with Rulfo, right? But what are the images that recur in your minds when you think about the story?
Think of the store. I think it feels to me, you know, where the two men are. It feels like one of those small, desolate, rural Mexican towns where the same store harbors a halfway pharmacy, store, halfway bar, sort of everything contained in one little four-walled space, you know, and it's the two guys sitting there. And the only description we get is the table, and there's an oil lamp, and the place is being eaten by termites. So that's really, I really stay with that image. And then sort of Luvina, because it's funny, it's called Luvina, but Luvina itself pops up only after I think about where they are.
I mean, I think that's just fascinating. I mean, I think Rulfo would be very interested to know that you know, kind of where the story was told about some other place. That's what stuck with you. I mean, that's because there isn't a ton about the store. I mean, the store.
No, there's just nothing. There's two objects. That's all we get.
Right. But there is a lot. I mean, we got the bartender, we got the light, we got the kids, we got that weird square of light, and we got the termites.
Well, and then what happens with you know, everyone's brain works differently, but you know, as I'm reading the guy talking, you know, there are the moments where he's specifically describing Luvina, the air, you know, that wind that haunts you and got inside of him, all of that. But in a lot of moments, he's just, you know, where he's looking at the beer, he's like, you know, are you gonna drink that, or how about we get some mezcalitos towards the end, he wants to hit the harder stuff. So there's a lot of moments with him just being in that space in the present. And yeah, I mean, I find the guy kind of fascinating and very personable, you know. It's like he knows how to tell a tale.
I think about the time where he describes the driver leaving them there. Before that, when he says, I have no problem going on telling you what I know in regard to Luvina. I lived there. I left my life there. I went to that place with my illusions intact and came back old and used up. And later it talks about how he couldn't get the guy to stay and let the animals rest. And he says, nothing but the plaza, without a single plant to break the wind, we stayed there. You know, it was that initial imprint was negative for him. The guy wasn't going to stay around, and his interpretation was, this must be a hell. This must be a terrible place. And allows that sort of to take hold. So this idea of it's easy to look at things from over here, merely recalled from memory where there's no similarity, he also says. So there's that song by U2 where Bono sings, you glorify the past when the future dries up. And I see so many instances of that in literature, you know, through a character who's been very nostalgic. Like, you know, the mother in the Glass Menagerie, recalling all her gentleman callers, right? And how great her youth was and how everything was so wonderful and perfect. And now everything's terrible. But this character is something happened. Something happened where he believes that in that past of his, that dried up. You glorify the past when the future dries up, but he's really turned that on its head. And because where he is now, I suppose, he has nothing. I mean, it's that much worse. He's drunk. That's really all we know about this character today, is that he's drinking way too much. And I don't know, in my experience, somebody who reaches across the table and drinks the other person's beer has got a problem. So, and not just that he's in that moment of, feeling pretty good and is a little loose-lipped and telling a great story. I just think that it's so easy, to say it again, it's so easy to blame the past for where you are right now and never have had that moment where you had to buck up and get it together, because the baggage from the past is always with you, and you have to make that decision to turn the corner, right? And he hasn't done that. And this is a lot of people's story, right? Sadly.
Yeah, and I think he's so transparent about where he's throwing the blame around, even to a point of, where I almost think this, I think this story is, could be read as a confession as much as anything else. I left my life there in that paragraph that you mentioned. In that strange sentence, which, it'd be great to look at the Spanish and see how well the translator did. It's easy to look at things from over here, merely recalled from memory where there's no similarity. And I think your interpretation of that through Bono helps me understand the sentence, actually, because I don't understand it really. And then further on, though, I cuts to the whole chase of the story. I have no problem telling you what I know in regard to Luvina. I lived there, period. I left my life there. I went to that place with my illusions intact, etc. But I left my life there. That is, I think, that's, what happened in the Luvina. He left his wife and kids in Luvina, I think.
Well, I think that that sentence there, that's also, that's part of the warning, right? It's easy, what you're seeing. I guess he's sort of telling the guy, what you're seeing now, me here drunk talking about this, might seem like nothing, but when I was there, it was, an arduous experience.
For me, the scene that always stays with me is the image of this family on their first night in Luvina, huddled together in a church. And then in the morning, the back of the church, they're trying to get out of the wind. There's a hole in the roof of the church. It's not like they can get much warmth in there. But right before sunrise, Rulfo writes, the wind calmed down a bit before sunrise. Later on, it came back. There was a moment at dawn when everything became still, as if the sky and the earth had joined together, crushing all sounds with their weight. You could hear the children breathing, now more relaxed. I could hear my wife breathing heavily next to me. And this is when they then hear the bat noise, which turns out to be these women who are up early in the morning to get water. But I wanted to just pause at that moment of this family huddled together, because I think the story, with a lot of Rulfo, you have to really slow down to see that it isn't all despair. I don't read that scene totally despairingly with this family. At one point, we're huddled together and he's listening to his kids breathe. It's not much, but it's something.
Juan Rulfo is the author of Luvina from the collection Llano en Llamas. It's translated by Ilan Stavans and Harold Augenbraum in The Plain in Flames, published by the University of Texas Press. Alberto Reyes Morgan is a graduate of the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. He's written and translated for the Voice of Witness oral history book series titles Solito, Solita, Youth Migrants from Central America, Underground America, Narratives of Undocumented Lives, and others. His story, Salt, was published in the fall 2020 issue of the Michigan Quarterly Review. He also translated for us the excerpt from The Writer in Flames from the interview collection De Vuelta, by Elena Poniatowska. He spoke to us from his home in Mexicali, Baja California. Peter Orner is the author of 6 books, including the story collection Maggie Brown and Others, and the memoir and essays Am I Alone Here? He holds the professorship in English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. This has been The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner from Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Bree Kirkham is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.